वेलकम टू आवर नेशन स्टेट डायलॉग सीरीज राष्ट्र राज्य संवाद श्रृंखला में आपका स्वागत है. 欢迎收看民族国家对话系列. I'm Dr. Geeta Kochar, moderator for today's discussion. Today it's our pleasure and privilege to have with us James Borton. James Borton is an independent environment policy writer and former Hong Kong-based foreign correspondent for the Washington Times. He has more than 25 years in Southeast Asia. He's a faculty associate at the Walker Institute in University of South Carolina. He was a National Endowment Humanities Fellow at Yale University, a non-resident fellow with Stimson's Southeast Asia program, the US Asia Institute, and Tufts University Science Diplomacy Center. He has a bachelor's and master's with honors in American Studies from the University of Maryland. He's also the senior fellow at Foreign Policy Institute, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. James Borton co-founded the Mekong Environment Forum in San Tho, Vietnam. He has edited 4 books, The South China Sea Challenges and Promises, published in 2015, Islands and Rocks in the South China Sea, Post-Hague Ruling, published in 2017, The Art of Medicine in Metaphors and Venture Japan, published in 2013. And today we have invited him for his latest book, Dispatches from the South China Sea, Navigating to Common Ground. Very warm welcome to you on our channel, Nation State Dialogue Series. Let me begin with just asking you to briefly introduce your book. What is this book all about and what you have written on that? Just a brief introduction onto that for our viewers.
Thank you again for this generous invitation. When we were in the midst of the pandemic, I wrote my book, and of course we all witnessed the pain caused to individuals and states around the world. But we are now facing another crisis, a crisis that I've seen up close and personal in the South China Sea. It's an ecological crisis, and it requires attention and engaged science cooperation for the fisheries management, ecological conservation of the coral reefs, and of course open access to data. My book really places faith and confidence in science, and it examines the role of science cooperation and the implementation of what we call science diplomacy as a kind of strategy to tap down the rising tensions among the claimant nations in the South China Sea. But food security is really central to my narrative, since fishers are the first to encounter the limits of the sea. This is most certainly true in the South China Sea. So while there are an increasing number of challenges that are emerging in that area, I'm turning to my marine science friends and some policy experts, as we have convened over the last 3 or 4 years at numerous conferences and venues to discuss how science can help address this looming food security issue in the region. The book's message is pretty simple. We need this marriage of policy and science to navigate these kind of perilous geopolitical matters. And so it's an opportunity to engage marine scientists as their voices should be heard along with the policy experts. So that is essentially what the book's narrative focuses on.
Yeah, congratulations to that. It's a wonderful, different perspective and an initiative where there are these diplomats talking about policies and things like that. But what is happening on the ground, how science can really play a major role in that, is very crucial. And I think COVID has also brought out those issues. But your book has brought out a new prism of looking at the diplomatic approaches to the South China Sea problem, especially the science perspective. So how do you think that a core geopolitical territorial issue or even an economic issue can be dissolved through this marine biology? Or how much will China agree to actively participate in such a conversation? And what are the possible challenges to such an approach?
Well, for sure, the historical, political, and economic territorial claims in the region are mired in a kind of complex and tangled web of nationalism. And yet the threats from climate change and illegal and unreported and unregulated fishing, rising sea levels, and habitat destruction impact all coastal nations. The science is clear. Create a place of whale refuge, or foster cooperative marine protected areas in which marine life can thrive, and overspill, that's providing fish for all. After all, the region serves as a main source of fish with some 16 million tons of fish sources from the South China Sea. So experts have continued to warn us of the intense competition for these marine resources. But in the face of the dire environmental challenges, more governments are committed to protecting up to 30% of the ocean territory by 2030. This is especially important in Southeast Asia, which is home to 62,000 miles of some of our planet's, well, most biologically diverse coral reefs. The common ground that I refer to, of course, is science, and the conservation and sustainability of fish stocks, of maintaining ecological balance of the region requires an understanding of how these living and non-living South China Sea resources are rapidly being exploited by the people of the region. So in extensive conversations and interviews, as I mentioned earlier, with marine scientists in the region, they've all shared how they have witnessed the gradual dismantling of life of the marine resources. But it's through their kind of collective knowledge that the message is certain. We are all in this together, and the body of ecological science remind us that life is interconnected. In short, these scientists strongly advocate for international cooperation. Let me answer the question about China. I mean, China has been participating in marine-focused workshops, and this has not been a kind of mainstream message. In fact, many of these workshops have been held very quietly, inviting claimant nation marine biologists to talk about the collective issues that affect all the coastal nations. So Chinese marine biologists, oceanographers know that too many fisheries are indeed collapsing. And so there's indeed an impetus to move forward in a kind of collective way to address this. And we've seen a rollout of more marine protected areas, our fish sanctuaries. In fact, it was in November of 2020 that China hosted a 2-day international ocean kind of governance program with a roster of speakers from the United States and South China Sea claimant nations, including the Philippines and Vietnam. And the theme of that program, that inaugural symposium, was maritime cooperation and ocean governance. So China knows that it's in dangerous waters since it has entered the kind of what we call the ecological conservation red line that reflects Beijing's urgency to protect marine spaces from development. So over the past 2 decades, what has China experienced? It's lost, what, 73% of its mangrove cover and over 80% of its coral reefs. And of course, its Yangtze and Pearl River estuaries are complete dead zones. So in this era of kind of environmental shifts and unprecedented economic development, China is joining the ranks of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and kind of undertaking a rollout of marine protected areas. And this is born out of necessity. Again, coming back to this theme of food security for all. So with these no development zones and conserving and restoring degraded coastal ecosystems, these are high priorities for everyone in the region. And that's part of this narrative that I continue to roll out. There are challenges, of course, because there's a lack of monitoring and enforcement that protects these marine protected areas. They're ineffective sometimes for remediating habitat degradation. And also, of course, the restrictions associated with the pandemic lockdown have prohibited any recent face-to-face meetings among these regional scientists. But I think now that the pandemic protocols have been at least partly lifted, I expect to see more confidence building science-driven workshops, in fact, this year in 2023. And China, since China has has more resources for tackling climate change, pollution, and fishery management, it would be easy for them to dominate any cooperative science efforts in the region. But also there's no agreed upon ASEAN code of conduct to address these environmental challenges. But for now, I think that the science can lead the conversation that can unite these individual nations' marine protected areas into an ecologically coherent network. That's what we'd like to see.
Yeah, but I mean, considering that US is really, decoupling with China, I mean, one of the issues most of the countries are looking, especially in India, we are looking at, is, the science should really, divert this whole policy thing. There has to be a collaboration with this, scientific community. But most of the time, there are these, doubts about China not being so very open with even with the scientific community. So whether that will work or not is one major issue I think we really need to push for. Globally, we need to really push for. But China is pushing to be a marine power and possibly aim to control the key supply lines. So how do you think this will impact the environment, and what sharing of responsibilities can the powers in the region undertake? Will a science collaboration, or rather a science diplomacy, work to address legal, environmental, and social issues, or will there be, something else that we need to do about that?
Let me try to decouple some of these questions. I mean, no one disputes that China is a maritime superpower, and its hard power expansionism is revealed in its modern navy, coast guard, paramilitary fleets that continue to ram fishing boats in the Indo-Pacific. They, of course, harass oil exploration surveys. They built military outposts on reclaimed atolls, and they're holding these regular combat drills. For that matter, China's Coast Guard is now the world's largest, boasting almost 260 offshore patrol boats, over 500 tons, including two massive 12,000-ton, 165-meter cutters that outclass all other Coast Guard ships and Navy vessels in Southeast Asia. But to be clear, as a major commercial artery for maritime goods, the South China Sea continues to experience even more tanker traffic and is more than 3 times that of the Suez Canal in terms of ships passing through its artery. But pollution is hard to avoid in the region. Between 330,000 and 1.6 million vessels also fish the sea, contributing to a direct impact on the fragile ecosystem. Also, China's land reclamation has destroyed more than 13 square kilometers of corals. Marine scientists like my friend, Professor John McManus here at the University of Florida, has spent almost 3 decades documenting the changes in the coral reefs in the region. He has also described to me at several South China Sea conferences and programs how these Chinese mega dredgers cut away at the coral and they wreck the seabed and they pile the material on top of living corals. So how does science diplomacy work with all of these bad actors taking place? I think it may not be able to address the complex legal issues surrounding the sovereignty claims, but it does offer a pathway. And I think that's what everyone's looking, a pathway for regional discussion and cooperation. For example, over a decade ago, the United Nations Environment Program had a program called Reversing Environmental Degradation Trends in the South China Sea and the Gulf of Thailand. And it was joined by Cambodia, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. So over half of the budget came from these nation states and other support from the UN Environment Facility. I think we have to view this as kind of a win-win science diplomacy scenario. It demonstrates that science diplomacy initiatives are financially possible, and it makes public policy effective with the aid of non-government organizations who are very good at sharing information since they raise awareness and build capacity at the local level. And I think that's something that we should be mindful of, the role of civil society and these non-government organizations and how they can help broadcast information. So in other words, science diplomacy is seen as all carrot with no stick for dispute management in the South China Sea, but also in political terms, science diplomacy is a safe approach for all governments. Collective scientific work to establish, let's say, marine protected areas can and does contribute to diffusing any threatening attitudes between these claimant nations. I mean, there are other examples, and that's going back to the 1970s and 80s between the United States, Russia, and China in the middle of the Cold War. And even more recently, as seen in the bilateral agreements in the joint oceanographic and marine scientific research expeditions in the South China Sea that were initiated in 1994 and ran through 2006 between the Philippines and Vietnam. What's really encouraging is that this year, in 2023, Vietnam and the Philippines are going to resume those bilateral joint oceanographic expeditions. So I think with more nations in the region, even rolling out marine protected areas, and with these initiatives, there are kind of clear, down-to-earth social benefits. Coastal citizens are becoming more engaged in environmentalism. And we're seeing this outreach through, as I mentioned earlier, NGOs who are actively engaged in the addressing some of the coastal issues related to plastics pollution and other things that impact on potential food security for the regions.
You absolutely mentioned very right. I mean, the civil society has a major role to play apart from the scientific community, and the policies will have a direct impact by how the civil society is going to really take over. But you just mentioned two of these countries, Philippines and Vietnam, and let me push to that itself. Do the Philippines and the Vietnamese share similar views or differences in their responses to South China Sea challenges and opportunities? Considering, both of these nations have certain major tensions with China. I mean, Philippines, we know about the geopolitical issues, the territorial claims. Though the recent, development between China and Philippines is quite positive. And also, what are the approaches of the United States of America for such an alternative route to resolving the conflict? I mean, it will at least dilute the major geopolitical, territorial issues that we have. How does the USA look at that?
Okay, well, there's a lot to unpack there. First of all, the Philippines is a representative democracy and Vietnam is the socialist country. But they both view the South China Sea as a kind of vital artery for their interest in the maritime world. But they have taken at times different and similar approaches in pressing their claims. Both countries see their claimed South China Sea areas as essential elements of national security, important trade channels, traditional fishing grounds, and a source of offshore energy resources. Hanoi and Manila have both proven the most vocal in expressing their alarm and concern over Beijing's assertiveness in the sea. However, both Vietnam and the Philippines have supported Washington's Indo-Pacific economic framework for prosperity that promises and pledges to build partner coalitions and develop collective responses to curb China's sphere of influence. At the same time, it appears that neither nation wants to become a pawn in the geopolitical battle between the United States and China. But of course, the Philippines have a mutual defense treaty with the United States, and when Chinese vessels have entered the areas around Whitsun Reef and the Spratlys, and the Philippines have not hesitated to deploy their own Coast Guard and Navy patrols and have flown surveillance aircraft to document these incursions. I think the South China Sea also took a major turn when the Philippines entered in the international legal route and went to the United Nations arbitration to challenge China's 9-dash line. Of course, they won that decision in 2016. However, as we know, China never accepted that verdict. On the other hand, Vietnam and China relations are shaped by a long history, almost 2,000 years. The economy, especially cross-border trade and geographic proximity, also are part of this unique relationship enjoyed by Vietnam and China. Hanoi's trade relationship with China has dramatically kind of curbed its responses to issues in the South China Sea. And of course, the ordinary Vietnamese knows very well the tortured history in terms of the incursions and the battles experienced between China and Vietnam, and even the contested oil and gas offshore blocks in the waters around Vietnam's southeastern oil fields have long been a flashpoint. In fact, I was in Vietnam and witnessed how tensions really spiked in May of 2014 as a rival Chinese and Vietnamese Coast Guard and fishing fleets clashed at sea. It resulted in the ramming of several Vietnamese wooden traditional vessels, and they were sunk. They were really blocking the actions of the Chinese National Offshore Oil Corporation, and they moved this large, deep water rig to drill test wells in exploration blocks located off of Vietnam's central coast. So both the Philippines and Vietnam are in agreement that they will protect and defend their national interest while upholding the security and stability in the region, I think through peaceful and rules-based approach. It's important to emphasize the rules-based approach, but it's clear that the power arrangements and alignments dictate the strategies of Vietnam and the Philippines. For now, I think it's very encouraging that Vietnam and the Philippines announced that they will resume their joint marine science expeditions. And as for the U.S. approach in the contested waters, they will most certainly here in 2023 continue their freedom of navigation exercises in their effort to uphold this kind of rule of law, and yet barring any comprehensive Indo-Pacific strategy, the U.S., despite significant budget deficits and the commitments made to Ukraine, I think they've indicated that they will provide, at least moving forward, some soft power support to the Southeast Asian nations around trade, technology, resilient supply chains, clean energy, decarbonization, and even maritime cooperation in the form of U.S.-ASEAN exercises to address typhoon early warning systems, disaster responses, maritime awareness, and more. But generally, it's this kind of confidence building, and it's also to promote peace and stability in the region. So the U.S. Certainly will continue its involvement in the region, but I think they'll use these kind of soft power approaches.
Yeah, I mean, we are hopeful that that is going to really change the kind of, assertiveness that we see of China, especially in relation to the small powers. You're talking about Vietnam, Philippines, even Cambodia and others, Indonesia and all of that. But one of the things which we're talking about South China Sea, and this is not directly related to your, things that you have, the narrative that you put in your book, but looking at the larger picture of it, there is an effect on the Asia Pacific region, of what happens in the South China Sea conflict. So what role can other regional powers play in this approach? Especially I'm looking from India's perspective. So especially India, which is working on its own Sagar policy, if you know about that, which is also based on these oceans and oceanic, research and, cooperation and things like that. Do you have some suggestions for them as well? I mean, as environmental concerns are becoming a serious issue for the entire humanity. I mean, you're talking about food shortages. I mean, of course, these are all the concerns even India has, I mean, the regional powers. So any suggestions on that as well? I mean, that's beyond what you have actually put in your book. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Well, as you said, I've not focused on New Delhi's maritime security policies. We do know that the intersection of the South China Sea with the greater Indo-Pacific region, they do relate, and there's a correspondence directly. And I believe that your government continues to adopt kind of a pragmatic and responsive strategy that is inclusive and sustainable in nature. You mentioned the security and growth for all in the region, our SACA, is indeed aimed at safeguarding maritime interest of India's mainland and your islands. But like China and the claimant nations in the South China Sea, India's maritime future is rightfully linked with economic development. I do want to comment about your country's kind of port-led development initiative and these kind of deep sea pillars for its blue economy focus on energy, ocean energy, deep sea mining, and of course, marine biotechnology. I'm thinking that maybe your Indian Ocean Rim Association, that it's brought together these Indian Ocean states to a common platform to promote maritime safety, that maybe this serves as an excellent model for the South China Sea claimant nations. And while what I've learned is that the SAGAR initiative emphasizes the role, the organization of the Indian Ocean Rim Association, and it's kind of facilitator for trade, effective fisheries management, and of course, promoting cultural exchanges. I think the willingness of India to collaborate with others in maritime diplomacy efforts is most valuable, since it enhances capacity and what's that important phrase, trust building. We need to see more of that. This is especially evident in how India has been encouraging the free and open Indo-Pacific idea. You've been a big champion of that. It's also encouraging to note that India is broadening its reach to include the Western Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea. In regards to the South China Sea, it's also significant and noteworthy that India has become a comprehensive strategic partner with Vietnam. So here's what I would encourage India to take a maritime leadership role here in 2023, and perhaps entertain hosting a Indo-Pacific maritime security forum that addresses the theme of global commons and the environment. And I mean, some of the panels or tracks might include things like piracy in the waters of the Indian Ocean, the Sulu Sea, South China Sea, climate change, natural and man-made disaster management, illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, maritime awareness, data sharing, and of course, what I mentioned, the network marine protected areas. So I believe that a planned Indo-Pacific Environmental Security Forum is not only timely, but fits into India's desire to engage nations in kind of issue-based alignments. And to bolster this idea, ASEAN appears to be seeking opportunities to engage in supplementary kind of regional groupings. So a forum hosted by India in 2023, I think, offers a global stage where science and diplomacy can intersect. And sure, the region is going to remain mired in many maritime territorial disputes, from the Persian Gulf to the Paracel and the Spratly Islands. And it does make international cooperation difficult to achieve. However, I think an Indo-Pacific maritime or marine environment forum that includes science helps inform policy initiatives and becomes kind of an inclusive program, and it may lead to further breakthroughs, dialogue, conversations with, again, marine scientists and oceanographers participating along with policy experts. I mean, after all, oceans are shared spaces where international cooperation is a prerequisite for peace building and security. So in my book, I've said, I write that we are all in this together, and the body of ecological science reminds us how much life is interconnected. Last week I saw James Cameron's new film, Avatar, The Way of Water. Now there's a message about our connection to the ecology, to our oceans, that we're all interdependent and connected. I was talking with my own family about this. I said, well, that's James Cameron's taking a passage from my book or two, but I give him so much credit in his efforts to educate and inform the world about how connected we are to the ocean. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm yet to see that movie, and I mean, I've heard a lot about that movie, and definitely I know what it is talking about broadly. But even the earlier, episodes of Avatar was really, really good. I mean, a message for the whole, world community to look into, issues which really impact everyone. I mean, as you said, oceans are for everyone. The challenges that we have is for the entire humanity, and we really need to have a collective approach to that. And as you just mentioned, in the region, if India is able to take a maritime leadership role, I mean, that would be really, really good. Very positive note on that. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure talking and listening to you, Mr. James Borton. I hope we continue our interactions. We'll have more about, a very positive and very different perspective on the policy approaches. Thank you very much. And to our viewers, please keep watching our programs and keep learning. Dhanyavad.